The following is a talk by Professor Troy Jollimore from the second evening of Leeds Love Month 2003 on the topic of love. He asks whether we love people for reasons. His talk was followed by one from Professor M.M. McCabe and by a Q&A, and both are also available as podcasts. Leeds Love Month was organised by the Centre for Love, Sex and Relationships at the University of Leeds, and we hope to improve relationships by studying intimacy. You can follow the Centre on social media for news of future events and publications. The talk series was generously funded by the Society for Applied Philosophy.
It's really nice to be here. What is love? That's our question for tonight. That's what they sent me when they invited me to do this thing. So, rather than answer the question that was asked, let me start with a meta question. A question about the question, what is love? Why is this question so hard to answer? I mean, we all know what love is. We've all got it in our lives, or we want it in our lives. It's pretty familiar, right? Why is this so hard? Okay, is this just my clever way of avoiding the question that I'm actually supposed to? Do I not have an answer? I've got part of an answer. I've got a suggestion. I just feel like maybe my answer's not enough given, you guys bought tickets for this, or how much were the tickets again? Okay, great. Thank God. You're going to get your money's worth tonight. This is great. So here's my partial answer then to the question, what is love? Borrowed from, I should check pronunciations. I'm so nervous saying anything about Plato with you in the room. This is terrible. Diotima?
I say Diotima.
Diotima. See, I've never said it that. I love it. That suggestion, borrowed from Diotima, who we hear from indirectly in the Symposium of Plato, through the mouth of Socrates, more or less, that love is, as she says and as he says, something in between. Now she means it in a bit of a different sense than what I'm going to be talking about, but certainly there's something right about this. And notice one significant advantage of this suggestion, that it helps answer my meta question. Why is it so hard to say what love is? Well, because, in a lot of cases we have a distinction of some sort, and we want to know which side of the distinction love comes down on. But in fact, it doesn't come down cleanly on one side or the other. It has elements of both. And so we have to adjust our thinking in some way. And love teaches us something about how to think about things, if I'm right about that. So I'm going to start. There'll be three big distinctions here I'll talk about in those terms. I'm going to start with another one, though, a preliminary distinction, which I won't try to resolve, but I want to mention it because this is big for a lot of people. And maybe in the Q&A it'll come back. Should we be romantics about love, or should we be cynics about love? Now, romantic views of love, the idea of true love and so on, right? We're all sort of familiar with this idea of true love, this being, of course, from The Princess Bride, that wonderful film. This also from The Princess Bride. Here's getting romantic about true love, right? Love is so amazing that it can conquer all obstacles. Not even death can overcome true love. All it can do is delay it for a while. Isn't that wonderful? Now, I want to give Princess Bride, because I think it's a lovely movie, credit for, to some degree at least, mocking the idea. It's gently toying with it, right? It's not just putting it out there and totally buying it into it, as I think some films do. And maybe, for instance, something more like, the name is not on the poster, but of course this is Sleepless in Seattle, which some of you will, like me, be old enough to have seen. And in case it's a little hard to read the text on there, so here it is. What if someone you never met, someone you never saw, someone you never knew was the only someone for you? I mean, that's a terrifying idea. I just think this is like a horror movie because, wouldn't it be awful if that were true and there's somebody out there and there's like 9 billion people on this planet? You've got to find that one person. Now, of course, part of the idea of true love, right, is supposed to be that you're destined to find them, and so the universe will make sure that you do. That's part of the romantic idea, and that it may push us perhaps into the other direction of the cynic. And so here's Professor Don Draper, some of you may know his work, with this lovely quote about love, right? What you call, and he works in advertising, for those of you who haven't seen Mad Men. What you call love was invented by guys like me to sell nylons. There's many versions of the cynical view, and this is only one. There's, of course, the scientific view, which tries to explain love away as all a matter of chemicals or something like that. That's not necessarily as cynical, and I think a lot of people who hold that don't think of themselves as cynical. But I think any attempt to explain love away has something a little cynical about it. Anyway, like I said, I'm not going to try to resolve the issue of romantic versus cynical, but I want to bring it up and put it out there. And I am going to say a couple things as I go on. I'll kind of come back to it later on. I'm very skeptical about this sort of Hollywood true love, destiny, overcoming death, and so on view. On the other hand, I am a romantic enough, I guess, to believe that there is such a thing as unconditional love, as long as we understand it correctly. And there'll be a very brief thing about that later on. And I even believe in a kind of love at first sight. But again, we have to understand it correctly. So towards the end of the talk, I'll be getting at that. But let me introduce some of the other distinctions, and the three big ones I'll be mostly talking about. Love, rational or non-rational. Is love a kind of rational phenomenon? Are there reasons why we love somebody? Or is it just thoroughly non-rational, something we just feel, something that just happens to us, a force that pushes us around against our will, perhaps? Well, in keeping with the theme of my talk, I'm going to say it's both to some extent. It's something in between those two. Now, again, I've taken my central phrase, something in between, from the symposium. But here I'm applying it differently. And in fact, I don't agree with Socrates and Diotima, at least of everything that they say in the symposium. I have some strong reservations about part of it, because they fall firmly on the rational side, as I read it at least, and they understand it in a way that makes love have kind of a rather unattractive feature, I think. I worry about it. So quoting from Socrates here, he's talking about the person who, as he says, loves rightly. And he says, beginning from obvious beauties, he, the lover who loves rightly, must for the sake of that highest beauty be ever climbing aloft, as on the rungs of a ladder. This is the famous ladder of Diotima you might have heard of. From one to two, and from two to all beautiful bodies. From personal beauty, he proceeds to beautiful observances, from observance to beautiful learning, and from learning at last to that particular study, talking about philosophy, I take it, which is concerned with the beautiful itself and that alone, so that in the end, he comes to know the very essence of beauty. So if you love someone on this view, because let's say they're beautiful and they're charming, then you ought to love every beautiful and charming person, because otherwise you're being arbitrary, you're not being rational, you're being inconsistent. But even this isn't enough. That's only the first step, right? You've become, a Don Juan or a Hugh Hefner, but that's not enough, because the next step, that's just a stepping stone to the higher, more abstract, purer form of love, which is to leave behind the individuals and love the properties, these abstract entities, which philosophers love, or at least we deal with and use them a lot and think about them. So we sort of go from being an ordinary person in the street to being Hugh Hefner to being Derek Parfit, or I don't know, some philosopher, Plato himself perhaps is really who we're supposed to end up being. Now, if you think, as I think we should, that ideal love does not require us to extend our love that promiscuously in order to be rational, to love everyone or to do our best to, let alone that, it's about not loving individuals at all, but rather properties as philosophical abstractions, then this might push you away from the idea of reasons in love. And you think, look, it has nothing to do with reasons at all, obviously. It's just, like I said, an emotional reaction. It's a feeling. It's a force that pushes us around. It's inconsistent, and it's okay that it's inconsistent, because feelings can be inconsistent. Okay, you can see the appeal of this. It's not a crazy idea. Love does sometimes feel like an irrational brute force. But still, I think this is an overreaction. I don't want to go that way. For one thing, it just seems to contradict the way we actually talk a lot of the time. We are very often to say what it is about someone that we love. I would say, for instance, that my love for Heather, my lovely wife, who's here, is in part a response to, you can use her as an example. I should have checked this with you. Sorry. You're okay with this, right? My love for Heather is in part a response to her intelligence, in part a response to her charm, her wonderful sense of humor, her beautiful eyes. I'm not going to try to list everything. I only have 30 minutes. So, but it could go on and on. But I'll do a few more later. But on the no reasons position, none of these statements can actually be right, except in the purely causal sense. These things maybe cause me to have this feeling. But it doesn't seem to capture my strong sense that these feelings about Heather render my love appropriate and fitting. It's not just a random attitude that might as well have been directed towards anything, or anyone, or even anything. So this seems like an unattractive choice to me, right? On the one hand, love has nothing to do with reason. There's no reasons for it. On the other hand, love has so much to do with reason that we end up being, as I'll put it, unreasonably reasonable. But are we really forced to make this choice? Is this a real dilemma? I've already tipped my hand, right? I've already told you my whole theme is something in between, and so you know what I'm going to say, that no, this is not a real dilemma. We can thread the needle here. We can have our cake and eat it too. So what does that something in between mean in this particular case? Well, I'll be really brief. There's a lot you could say about this. Some people like me have gone on a great tedious length about it, but tonight I'll be brief, But what does it mean? First, that love is somewhat amenable to reason and to reasons, but not entirely. So not everything, what we should say is that there are reasons for love, but they only go so far. Not everything is determined by justifying reasons, or as we say in ordinary conversation, good reasons. Some things in love are just caused. And from the standpoint of reason or justification, they are essentially arbitrary. There's a reason in the sense of a causal explanation, right? But that's as far as it goes. But an event that is arbitrary in that sense doesn't have to be an event that goes against reason, and it certainly doesn't have to suggest that emotional responses are by their nature random and not supported by any sort of reason in themselves. If I'm driving and the brakes in my car suddenly fail and my car goes out of control, and I respond, as I'm sure I would, by being terrified, the failure of the brakes is a random event, but my fear response is entirely reasonable. It's fitting to the situation that is taking place. So Romeo loved Juliet, but I'm betting that if Romeo had never met Juliet, if some chance occurrence had prevented them from meeting each other, he probably sooner or later would have met and fell in love with some other winsome maiden, call her Maddie, or Sybil, if you like, either way. And if he had, his love for Maddie would have been appropriate. He would have had reason to love Maddie, just as given that he did meet Juliet and get to know her and get to appreciate all her fine qualities and so on, he had reason to love Juliet. So this fairly obvious point, I think, about the relation of, the role of causal explanations in this kind of situation gives us a distinction between what makes people lovable and what makes it the case that we actually do end up loving them. Love displays a feature that we find in many choice situations in our lives. There's a variety of choices that we might make, and which choices we do make, or which ones we have the opportunity to make, are heavily influenced by circumstances that aren't under our control and are in large part arbitrary matters of chance. Reason and brute causation both have roles to play, and both form part of the explanatory story about just why does I end up loving the particular people I do. And it isn't just about who we meet either, it's also about when we meet them and under what circumstances and how we're feeling at that time, what's going on in our lives, right? All sorts of things that might influence that. Even before he met either Juliet or Maddie, Romeo might have met somebody else, let's say Matilda, who was also winsome and charming and had all those fine features and so on, but she just might have left him cold. Why? Because in this way, too, love falls short of being completely determined by rationality. The fact that an emotional response would be fitting and thus justified if you had it doesn't necessarily imply that you would be wrong not to have it. If somebody insults you, it might be that if you get angry, you're justified in getting angry, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a mistake for you not to get angry. You might just shrug it off. I'm not going to let it bother me, you might say. Sometimes these emotional reactions are optional to some degree. You have to be in the right place, the right mindset, the right mood, the right frame of mind, and so on, to actually fall in love with someone, no matter how lovable, objectively speaking, they might be. Love, as we say, is a matter of chemistry. Even when qualities and reasons are present, it requires a spark to get the flame going. This spark you can see depicted in this still from a film that I won't identify, but some of you will know what it is. Okay, next distinction, active or passive. And I tried, by the way, I really wanted to find a slide to go along with this one. So these are the active lovers. I wanted a slide of two people who are clearly in love, sort of lying lazily on the floor or on a couch or something, just being passive love, but I couldn't find one. I didn't have the time. So we'll only show the active lovers. The passive lovers are too lazy even to show up and be in the slide. So this is what I have as my illustration. Second distinction to talk about is love active or passive. It's both. You know what I'm going to say. It's both. It's something in between. Let me explore this and explain again a little of what I mean by an analogy with perception. A lot of my book, Love's Vision, which Luke kindly mentioned, is devoted to exploring this analogy with perception. Maybe it's even a little more than an analogy, but anyway, it's at least that. So let's ask about perception. Is perception active or passive? Now, a fair number of philosophers leap immediately to the idea that perception must be passive, because these images of the world sort of just impose themselves on us. I'm looking around right now and I see the room, and I can't help, I can't just choose to see whatever I want. I've got to see the room as it is, more or less in front of me. And I'm hearing the sounds in the room, mostly my own voice at this point. But I'm hearing, whatever sounds there are in the immediate vicinity and so on. And these things are sort of imposed on me, like I'm almost afflicted with them, the way I would be like with a headache or something. Like I can't help it, right? And that's true, of course, up to a point. But on the other hand, first, there's the obvious fact that I can affect the nature of what I perceive just by doing simple things like turning my head, closing my eyes, right? Something like that. Leaving. If I really didn't like what I was seeing here, I could just leave, and then I would see some different things. If I want to see better, I can get a microscope, a telescope, some night vision goggles, whatever is called for by the situation. And of course, there's other more subtle and sometimes long-term ways I can influence my perceptions, and I'm really sort of more interested in these. A lot of them are what we call education in one form or another. So if I'm in a museum trying to look at a painting, like let's say Rembrandt's The Night Watch, I'm first going to engage in the kind of thing I was just talking about, where I'm going to kind of move around in front of it to look at the best place to see it from, right? You see people in art museums doing this all the time. But then, I find the best place, I'm looking at it in good light and so on. I still don't see it as richly or as deeply as I could, right? What do I do now? Well, I go find a book about Rembrandt, or I go take a course about Rembrandt, or I look at a lot of other Rembrandts, as Aristotle would suggest, right? Something like that. I become educated, I learn more. There's all sorts of options here, and all of these will change the way, literally, and I mean this literally, I want to be clear about that, literally change the way I see that painting. A painting just doesn't look the same to, say, a Rembrandt expert as it does to someone like me, who really, I don't know that much about Rembrandt. Any more than an X-ray looks the same to a person who is trained in reading X-rays, or a recording of the late John Coltrane, or of bird songs from a particular biozone would sound to a person who is highly knowledgeable and so knows what they are hearing in that deep level, which I wouldn't have in most of those cases. So perceiving is in large part an active process, and in its way, it's a demonstration of skill. And perceiving well is a kind of achievement. So maybe, to bring it back to persons for a second, maybe it takes a certain degree of commitment to spending time with someone, to working towards a kind of openness and intimacy with them. And I'm going to come back and say a little more about openness and intimacy in a moment. Engaging in certain activities and so on with them to really get to know someone and really be able to appreciate on that deeper level their lovable qualities. If this is so, then of course that's one straightforward reason why we can't just love everybody, because we can't see everybody that way. It takes too much time and too much work. We can't even love everyone who is lovable. Our cognitive resources and temporal resources are finite. Now, having said that, let me say this. I think the most significant reasons why we can't love everyone are not about those practical limits, though those are real. I think the significant ones are conceptual. The analogy with perception is meant to cast light on this too. Perception is inherently perspectival. You always see or hear things from a certain location, from a certain perspective. People sometimes talk about seeing things from a God's eye point of view or something like that. And that's a convenient turn of phrase, and it's an interesting sort of theoretical postulate, but there's really no such thing. We really can't even imagine what that would actually be like. To see in any manner, to perceive in any ways, to perceive from somewhere necessarily. And part of this includes the idea that seeing some things means not seeing others. Not seeing the things that are blocked by the things that I do see, not seeing things that are behind the back of my head, and so on, not seeing things that are so far away that I just can't see them from here, and so on. I would claim that we can make no real sense of the idea of having a vision of the world that is not a vision from some location or other. I want to move on to the next distinction, open or closed. Now, it seems to me that understanding love in this way, and drawing on the analogy with perception that I've mentioned, helps us understand the nature of intimacy. To talk about intimacy is to enter conceptual terrain in which love, in a way rather different than those I've been discussing up to this point, is something in between. That is, love is something which, rather than existing trapped inside of us in a way, exists between people, between human beings. That is one of the great themes of Martin Buber's writing, for instance, among others. For me personally, one of my own, the most meaningful statements to me comes from the great philosopher Celine, played by Julie Delpy in this wonderful film Before Sunrise by Richard Linklater. How many of you have seen Before Sunrise? You all need to go see this wonderful film, so good. I'm writing some stuff about it now, so I'm rewatching it a lot because of that. And Celine at one point in this film says the following. I cheated a little bit, by the way, in the slide, because this is not the scene where she actually says this. This is a scene I love very much. It's an amazing scene. But she actually says this a little later on in the time that they spend together. But this is, anyway, the thing that she says. You know, I believe that if there's any sort of God, it wouldn't be in any one of us, not you or me, but just this little space in between. If there's any kind of magic in this world, it must be in the attempt of understanding someone, sharing something. And I've left the punctuation out of the last few words because it's ambiguous exactly how that ought to be punctuated. And I tend to think that's actually potentially deliberate, but maybe I'm reading too much into that, who knows. Anyway, there's a lot of things to say about this provocative comment, but for my purposes, I'm going to focus on the concepts of mutuality and reciprocity and their connection again with openness between people. When I love someone, I open myself to them and they open themselves to me. I drop my defenses, right? I lower my shields. We have all sorts of different ways of talking about this. I take off my mask. I let myself be seen as I truly am. This is a large part of what we mean by intimacy. Love exists in the space between, in part, because when we love someone, that space between becomes transparent. Think of the various metaphors that we use to express related states using the word open, like standing out in the open and being an open book, being open to somebody's thoughts, right? We talk about this in all sorts of ways. Since being open is so crucial to intimacy and thus to love, we might naturally leap to the conclusion that love is the opposite of being closed. Yet again, however, we shouldn't jump to that conclusion. That would be to endorse a kind of false dilemma that we're better off avoiding. And in fact, here, it's not even just that love, in my view, involves both openness and closedness, but those are really two sides of the same thing. They depend on each other. We can't be open without being closed. Okay, what do I mean by that? That's a wonderful philosophical paradox, Jollimore, right? You're all saying. You're Joe saying it anyway. I don't know what the rest of you, Joe saying it. What do I mean by that? Okay, suppose that your lover is trying to tell you something difficult. Because you love her and care for her, you want to listen. You want to really hear her. You want to give her your full attention without judging or distorting what she's saying. You want to be open to her. So what does this mean, again? It means you have to close yourself off to all those parts of you that would get in the way, all those tendencies that we all have, preconceptions about this person, defensive and self-protective urges, fear of being disturbed or offended, just our proclivity to judge. And notice that this stuff isn't all about you. Some of it's about you. Some of it's about, to use Iris Murdoch's wonderful phrase, that fat, relentless ego. But it's not all about you. It's also about other people. In order to really hear this person, you have to close yourself off, at least for a time, to other people as well and the demands that they put on you. So the philosopher Christopher Cordner has this nice example in one of his papers. It's a paper on unconditional love. I told you we'd come back to that topic. I coached my son's community football team when I was 10. My assistant coach, Dennis, had a boy in the team. He also had a younger son, Toby, with pronounced physical and intellectual disabilities. He used to come to the football games with Dennis. One day, at a big moment in an important match for the team, with Dennis and I both fully focused on the play, Toby came up to ask his father for something. The loving and wholly attentive patience with which Dennis turned and immediately responded to Toby has always remained with me as an example of what real attentiveness, real loving presence to one's child here and now is. So I think it's very interesting that the particular notion that Cordner is explicating here is the idea of unconditional love. And I'll be very brief on this, but this interests me in part because it's very different from unconditional love as many people talk about it, where we think about it in terms of time and extended time. If you love somebody unconditionally, it means you'll be with them forever, you'll stand by no matter what, for richer or poor, right? That kind of thing. And this is a very different notion of time that's in play here. It's not about the extended future and that kind of temporality. It's about the present moment, what's going on here. How much of myself am I giving to this person? To love conditionally, in a sense here, isn't about what happens in the future. It's about whether I'm holding myself back now. I think this is quite fascinating. And I find it very attractive as a notion of unconditional love, that I, as somebody who is sort of skeptical about romanticism to some degree, can still live with and endorse. So I've been emphasizing perception in this part of the talk, and seeing in particular, but I do want to say before leaving this part of it, intimacy has other elements as well. In particular, In addition to being open to being seen and heard and so forth, it also involves being open to being shaped and influenced and changed by the person that you love or the people that you love. It's not just about seeing and hearing your lover, but it's about being guided by them as well and following their lead. This phenomenon of being shaped and directed by one's friends and lovers also involves emotional vulnerability and lowering your defenses. And it's also a kind of openness that involves being closed, because you can't be open to everyone in that way. I mean, maybe somebody could. I'm not sure I can imagine it. But at any rate, if somebody was, they wouldn't really have any friends. There would be nobody in particular who had a special relationship to them. They would just be an extremely malleable person with no real character at all. So I want to use an example to bring these three distinctions, make them a little bit more concrete. And I can go through this very quickly. But the example involves this little guy for reasons that will become apparent in a second. Let me try to bring some of these ideas together with this example. The example is taken from a paper by the philosopher David Velleman. And I choose it in part because, like the example from Chris Cordner's paper, it involves not romantic love or friendship, but a kind of love, the love of parents for their children, that is often thought to be really hard to reconcile or incompatible with views that have it that when we love somebody, we're responding to their lovable qualities, the kind of view, again, I tend to favor. And I think they're not incompatible, but again, we have to see how it works, right? So Velleman here is talking about the process of watching his children grow up, and as they do so, engage with and explore various different activities, hobbies, and pursuits. Once my children adopted some directions, and there have been many different directions over the years, I found myself caring about their progress in these directions, no matter how little intrinsic value I might have been inclined to see there in advance. In a quick succession of years, I became deeply interested in lacrosse and Morris dancing, poetry slams, and photography, and specifically in the accomplishments of a particular midfielder, Morris dancer, poet, or photographer, because these were the directions that my children had set for themselves. Of course, I eventually learned to appreciate some of these accomplishments intrinsically. I would realize with amazement that I was cheering as my son walloped a schoolmate with a metal stick, or that I was applauding choreography that previously would have struck me as no more than quaint. But I learned to appreciate those accomplishments to begin with because they were the ones that my children had chosen to cultivate. In other words, I learned to appreciate them out of love for my children. So among other things, of course, I take this to be an example of what I mentioned a moment ago of how in love we let people shape us. And here, of course, parents guide and shape their children in all sorts of ways, but Velleman's children are shaping and guiding him as well. He becomes a different person because of their interests. So let me use this again as a concrete illustration of those three oppositions I mentioned, run through them quickly and just sort of say, in each case, what does it have to do with this? Rational versus non-rational. Well, David Velleman is responding to real objective values that are inherent in his children's activities. Since these activities do have real value, his response is a fitting response to these things. But of course, objectively speaking, it's not as if he has assessed all the different activities out there and he loves these because they're the most valuable ones from an impersonal standpoint or something like that. There's obviously a subjective element in this as well. It's not based on an objective assessment of their relative worth. It arises from his care for and his attachment to his children and his willingness to be guided by them in their decisions. And note, of course, that we can say the same thing about the way he values his children themselves. He doesn't love his children, especially as he does as a parent, because he thinks, well, objectively speaking, they're the best children on earth. He hasn't, I hope that's not what he thinks. I've met people that seem to think that, but I think that's not what's going on with David Velleman. His concern for them is fitting, since it expresses a recognition of the infinite incomparable value of a human individual. But the fact that he's directing this kind of love to them and not towards other individuals doesn't come from the objective impersonal standpoint. The second one, of course, active versus passive. Velleman is actively searching out and learning to appreciate the values of these activities that his children are engaging in. At the same time, to the extent that he's shaped by their behavior and their valuings and choices, he is in that sense passive with respect to this. Note that although he's bestowing a kind of subjective value on these pursuits by actively valuing them and being guided, this doesn't negate the fact that he's appraising the value of these pursuits in the process. All of this is compatible if we understand, what really goes on in these cases. And finally, open versus close. Obviously, he is open to the value of his children's pursuits in a way that, again, involves being closed to other things. He's not open in the same way to the pursuits of any child in the neighborhood or anyone he happens to hear about or anything like that. So notice that the kind of love that parents feel for their children is not a love in any way that is entirely disconnected from reasons or from the recognition of value. That's one of the things I'm trying to use this example to show and to bring out. It's better to say that it's a love that seeks out certain kinds of reasons and values based on an initial attachment. Here, in this case, the attachment between parent and child. And the same, of course, I think goes for friendship love and romantic love, although there the nature of the initial attachment especially is different. It's not a parent-child familial bond of any sort. It's attraction, with more options for choosing, for pursuing and not being pursued, and etc. The different elements are weighted in different ways. They have different contours, obviously, and this is obviously things we can talk about in Q&A if people are interested. But ultimately, I think there's something more similar about the process than we often recognize. Philosophers especially have this tendency to think, that parent-child love, for instance, is completely different from friendship or romantic love. And in some ways, it's obviously different. I don't think it's different in every way. Moreover, I want to come back. This is more or less my where I'll conclude. Notice that what I've described is really a form of love at first sight. The parent loves their children before they know anything about them, who they're going to be or anything like that. Many parents speak of this experience, right? Not all, but it's a common experience I've heard from many parents. They love the child immediately. Some people claim they love the child before they met the child. I think there are versions with romantic love as well. And again, I think they actually have more in common with the parent-child case than perhaps we might at first recognize. It doesn't only happen there, though that might be the most common or familiar sort of case. In romantic love cases, of course, we aren't committed again initially, especially to the same degree or in the same way. There's more of an option, especially for a long time, to opt out and leave if you want to. We're more dependent on an initial attraction, a feeling of promise, and intuition regarding a possible future with this person before us. In general, people would be more likely to conclude in this case that they were wrong and to walk away after a time. It's a lot easier to abandon a romantic lover, especially in the early stages, than to abandon one's child, and probably for very good reasons. By contrast, one tends to be substantially more determined when the beloved is one's child to find something lovable about them, even if it turns out to be hard in some cases. On the other hand, long-term romantic relationships, I think, including long-term marriages, often come more to resemble familial relationships, to the degree that a person might be committed both to the relationship and, again, to finding things attractive about one's partner, especially if some of the initial things have changed, because, of course, people change over time. So, in as much as I believe in the possibility of love at first sight, I guess I am a romantic at heart as far as that goes. Although you're not going to catch me watching Sleepless in Seattle or Serendipity anytime soon. Or if you do, it'll be with a lot of sarcastic complaining. Maybe we should say that love at first sight is kind of a romantic notion and kind of not. If so, then it itself, like the more general phenomenon of love, turns out to be in a very real sense something in between. How am I going to end this? What happened to everybody who was kind enough to come to this talk? Well, of course, they lived happily ever after. One last romantic gesture, and now I cede the floor to my colleague.